Shaun Donovan, thank you so much for sitting down with us today. If it wasn't for COVID circumstances, you would have probably gone to Israel and attend the conference in person.
You had to remind me, Tal. I'm still sad I couldn't make it in January, but I'm really looking forward to having the cadets here in New York, to meeting all of you, and to making it over to Israel very soon.
But it is our pleasure. We're very lucky to have you here with us today.
It's great to be with you.
So if I was to go outside right now to the streets of New York City and ask passersby around who is Shaun Donovan, most people would probably tell me former HUD secretary under President Obama, housing secretary for Mayor Bloomberg, a recent mayoral candidate here in the city. But I would like to begin this conversation, if I may, at an earlier point in your career, because that is where people watching us in the audience are at these days, this point in their life, and ask you a simple question that you've probably been asked many times before, and that is, what drove you very early in your career to take your education, your skills, your early experience, and bring it all to the public sector rather than the private one, which, as we know, is more financially lucrative?
Yes, I definitely didn't do it for the stock options in government. But look, I'm a lifelong New Yorker. When I was growing up in this city, literally the South Bronx was burning. That was the city I saw. Homelessness was exploding on the streets, and it lit a fire in me. It outraged me, frankly, to see my hometown falling apart, to see people with nowhere to live. And it really spurred me, not necessarily to go into public service at first, but to get deeply passionate about housing and community development and homelessness, and eventually to make my way to the public sector. And I will say, for young people, that is the wonderful thing about public service, is that at the end of the day, people aren't in it for the stock options. They're in it because they're passionate about making a difference in the world. And that's the reason to go into it, and that's the reason to stay in it.
You sound full of satisfaction.
I'm a public service junkie, I like to say, and I wouldn't want it any other way.
Well, we are thankful for it as part of the public.
Thank you.
Talk to us about the transition you made from being a public servant into politics. It may appear as a natural route to take, but not every public servant takes this course and transitions into politics. It's not for everyone.
It's not, and actually, if you'd asked me for most of my life whether I'd ever run for office, I would have said you're crazy. For me, politics has also always been a means to an end, that it was a route to be able to make a difference in the world. And frankly, without understanding and really studying, becoming adept at politics, you're never going to get big things done in public service. But for me, it was always secondary. The big change for me was to try to run for elective office. And I did that, frankly, because I felt I could make the biggest difference by trying to be mayor of my hometown.
Would you recommend it to young professionals?
I think you really have to know yourself. And public service alone is a choice that people make. It's not for everyone.
There is a sacrifice.
There is a sacrifice, absolutely. It is also, I often used to say, I don't like my job every day, but I love it every day. It's hard. There's bureaucracy, and there's so many people watching your every move, the press, but also the public. And it can be hard. You have to be someone who is, I like to say, patiently relentless, someone who can understand that the fastest way between 2 points isn't always a straight line.
Well put.
But to keep your eyes on the prize. Because if you become too patient, then you stop getting things done, and you become part of the problem, I think, rather than part of the solution.
So speaking of prizes, let's talk about what would you define as the greatest achievements in your career? What, when you go to bed, you wake up in the morning and you feel satisfied and good about the choices, the professional choices that you've made.
Yeah, a lot of my friends told me I was crazy when I decided to become housing secretary in the midst of the worst housing crisis of our lifetimes.
Probably.
And I'm pretty proud that I was part of helping this country, and in some ways the world economy, recover from that housing crisis and the world financial crisis. And as someone, as I mentioned, watching homelessness explode on the streets of New York as a kid, the work we did, we cut veteran homelessness in half nationally. We cut family homelessness by a third. So that was all as part of my national work. But I think locally, for me, as someone who was spurred into public service by the terrible conditions in New York City, the Bronx burning, and so many other challenges, to have been part of the revitalization, and I mean part of because it's happened over 50 years. If you go back to the same neighborhoods I walked through as a kid that were decimated, that looked like Dresden after World War II, those are neighborhoods that are now alive and have come back. And I got to play a small role in doing that. And there's no satisfaction that you can have, I think, better than making a difference in your hometown if you care about public service.
For sure. Let's talk about urban renewal, the redevelopment of neighborhoods by the state. It's a controversial concept, and not only in the United States, for a few reasons. And one of them is that very often small business owners, small businesses in poor, lower income communities feel as if they are being pushed aside by new, big, shiny projects and wealthier communities. How can we avoid gentrification, and is it necessarily a bad word?
Well, Tal, you put your finger on something that is a huge issue. And, you know, this has been true for hundreds of years. Literally, if you go back and look at St. Peter's Square in Rome, where the Vatican is, that was a huge urban renewal project. The boulevards of Paris that Haussmann designed, that was pushed many, many people out of those neighborhoods to build those. Right here in New York and across the US, the urban renewal program was something that is very controversial. But here's the thing. First of all, to go back to your second question, when Mayor Bloomberg was interviewing me to become his housing commissioner, that was his very first question. What should I do about gentrification? And I said, first of all, it's a good problem to have. It is a problem, but you'd rather have that problem than the opposite, which is what I saw in New York growing up, which is no one wanted to live here. We lost a huge share of our population and jobs. So the question is really, how do you harness the economic growth that drives gentrification, but to revitalize communities in a way that it actually happens with and for the community rather than to the community. And that's something that really is driven first by affordable housing. If people can stay where they live in their neighborhoods for the long term, and I'm a big believer that when you redevelop housing, you should make it permanently affordable. But second, you need to really make sure that you're investing in all of the things that make those communities accessible and strong over the long term. We have lots of experience of being able to do that, but it's hard. And really what it takes is working very closely with local communities. Here in the United States, for the last 50 years or so, we've had a whole movement that's happened called community development, where local nonprofit organizations made up of community members have become very powerful players, actors in redevelopment of their own communities. It really started in the South Bronx, and I studied those efforts as a young person and have really tried to build on those in my public service career, where you partner with communities and give communities a real voice in the redevelopment of their own neighborhoods.
So if I understand it correctly from your vast experience, both in New York City and also on the national level, you do believe that it is a commitment by authorities. That is something that authorities need to do in order to create thriving, diverse communities. It's not something that should be allowed to develop naturally. There should be a government involvement there.
Well, look, as a lover of cities all over the world, cities are organisms that grow and develop and take their own life. And so obviously you need to, government can't do everything. I believe in the freedom we have in the US for communities to choose their own directions. But what I will say is that no city, no place is built without some framework of legal ownership and infrastructure investment and all these other things. And so what I would say, Tal, is first of all, you know, the Hippocratic Oath where they tell doctors first do no harm. As a public servant, I think what's really important is to first make sure that the rules that you're setting up actually aren't counterproductive. They're not standing in the way of people living together, of thriving, diverse communities developing. And that's something, unfortunately, we have a shameful history in the US where government segregated people. And the history of slums across the world has often been driven by laws and rules that purposefully built communities that separated poor people, that separated minorities. And so the first thing I think you have to do is make sure that government is working productively towards creating integrated and diverse communities. But second, what I would say is it's also really important that you have to be investing in those communities in ways that allow people, both on one hand, lower income people to move to communities of opportunity. This is two sides,
so
right?
that you don't hinder a natural process, a natural progress.
Yes, but also it can often be that when neighborhoods become very expensive, that it's harder and harder for low-income people to move in. But what about our teachers? What about our firefighters? What about all the people that you need within a community, other workers? You have to be able to build affordable housing and access to those communities for people to be able to make sure that there's a way for communities to be whole and to be successful. And increasingly what we're seeing in the US and in other places around the world is growing economic inequality that's geographic inequality as well. And I think it's a real problem for the growth of our cities and our economy.
So allow me to take you now on a journey to the Israeli periphery, where we do see this widening gap that you just mentioned. On one hand, we have massive construction in certain areas in the periphery, growing neighborhoods and high demand. And on the other hand, you have weaker, poorer, lower income communities in the suburbs, in the periphery, where real estate value is just decreasing. What do you think should be the right government or local authority approach to this widening gap? Is there something that can be done about it?
Well, I go back to my own beginnings, and I picture the South Bronx and the New York City that I saw growing up. If you go back to those same neighborhoods today, 50 years later, they are thriving, many of them. And so, yes, it is absolutely possible, but it takes long-term, dedicated investment and work to be able to do it. So, absolutely, it's worth doing. What I would say is that often when we're thinking about revitalizing those areas, we start with all the problems. We focus on what's wrong with those communities. And the most effective efforts that I've ever seen to revitalize communities begin in the opposite way. They start with, what are the assets of a place? Are there particular local, whether it's a university or a hospital or an anchor institution, as we call them, are there particular skills that people have? Like the city of Detroit, when it was on its knees, we worked to build new kinds of high-tech manufacturing there because of the skills of the people there. So what I always like to start with is, what are the assets that you can build on? And then how do you connect those assets to the larger regional, whether it's specific investments like transportation and infrastructure, physical infrastructure, or is it investing in economic growth, skills, or other things that are going to help connect that place to regional growth where there are assets that you can build on?
So what does the future hold for the periphery, for the suburbs?
Look, I think that what we've seen is that more and more people are demanding, even if they're living in the periphery, to have choices. They want to live in places where they're not going to be sitting in traffic for an hour in their car, that there's a place to walk or bike and to have alternatives, what I would call more sustainable communities. And so the most successful suburbs are ones that are really investing in creating those kind of opportunities. They're connecting themselves, whether it's through light rail or bus rapid transit or a whole range of means, to the central business district and to jobs, but also thinking about how they create cores that are more walkable, where we're not in giant shopping malls with 1,000 parking spaces, but places that you can walk to and really experience in different ways. Those are the places that I think are succeeding.
So New York City, it's the one place that people all around the world keep looking up to The value of the cultural assets here, the historical ones, touristic ones, is very clear, it's very obvious, and it's high. But what about less attractive, less central assets? How can we increase their value?
Well, Tal, going back to what we talked about before, I think you do have to start with assets. Every place, no matter how much it's struggling, has things that are unique about it and you can build on. And so I think part of that is understanding at a regional level, is that location one that can be improved? Can it be better connected to jobs in a particular place? Can you bring an anchor institution or build on an anchor institution like a hospital or a university or others that really can be the core of how you revitalize and grow a place? And then on a more local basis, to really think about how people live every day. What are the parks like? What are the ways that you can beautify a place or really make it a more attractive place to live? Because if you're in a region that's succeeding, but you have a place that's not, there are going to be ways that you can make it a place that people want to live, even if it's not going to be where they work.
So Shaun, I know that you have some Jewish roots, which as far as I'm concerned, it makes you part of the tribe. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm part of the Lost Irish tribe, the Donovanowitzes.
There's probably one. Are you curious about visiting Israel anytime soon? If you go there, what would you be interested to see?
I am absolutely interested, and again, disappointed I couldn't make it in January, that the conference got delayed. And I do have roots. My father's mother's father was Jewish, but much more importantly, Tal, to me, is that I am someone who grew up in New York City, deeply enmeshed in Jewish culture, to the point that my sister converted, and I always feel like the spiritual, social, and cultural ways that Judaism welcomed me were critically important to me in giving me a moral center and a moral core. And
so when are you going to Israel next?
Well, as soon as I can make it, I would love to go in the next few months and to visit with all the cadets. I would obviously, no one could go without visiting the holy sites in Jerusalem, and I will absolutely do that. But my wife is a huge foodie, and we've heard everything about the Tel Aviv markets and food. I want to hike in the Golan Heights. There are many things I want to do.
So, you know, the audience watching our interview now consists of young professionals, young cadets at the very beginning of their career, and they're destined to work in the public sector in Israel, in local governance, local communities. What is your golden advice for them?
Well, first of all, I would say they're lucky to have found it early in their careers. I was someone who thought I would work in a nonprofit. I started in a local nonprofit and ultimately found public service because my mentor from graduate school invited me to come work for him. And so I was very lucky to do that. But part of what I learned is that there's enormous value in working at the local level. I started at a local nonprofit. I worked in city government before going to national government. And what it taught me was really how things work on the ground, how to stay connected to communities. And what it also taught me is, to go back to where we started this conversation, is to keep me in touch with the passion that I have. Government can be hard. The bureaucracy can be relentless. It can feel some days like you're not making any progress. You can feel very distant from the impact that you're making in people's lives on the ground. And so my advice would be, stay connected to that. Find ways to visit local communities. As a leader in the public sector, I always tried to make sure that the teams I was working with knew that that piece of paper that they were signing or the policy that they were making, how was it going to make a difference in somebody's life? And to tell stories, to connect them to people, to go out into communities. Because if you're going to be in this public sector for a long time, you need to keep connected to that passion that started you doing it in the first place.
So what would you have told yourself of 25 years ago? And my guess is 25 years ago, but let's keep it there.
You know, I have to say, I don't regret the choices that I made. It took me a while to get to public service early in my career. And I think every one of those experiences, working for a local nonprofit, traveling the world, seeing cities in other places. I worked as an architect for a while in Italy, actually, before coming back to graduate school. All of those really gave me a broad perspective about what makes New York and the US unique, and spurred a passion for this work that I've kept for my entire career.
Before we let you go, just talk to me about the programs for training of future public servants here in the US. How does it work, and is it really proving itself? What's the importance of such programs that we have in Israel and you have here?
Well, the cadets is a great example. We have programs in the US that are incredibly important. And part of it is the training and what you learn, and finding what are other people doing in other parts of the world that are really remarkable. I know when I was housing secretary, I loved meeting with my counterparts in other countries because I would always hear what people were doing differently. You know, this is one of the problems with being in government. When I was housing commissioner in New York or housing secretary in Washington, it wasn't like I could go across town and talk to the other housing commissioner. You're a monopoly in some ways. And what that means is it's much harder to find networks and to learn from each other. And so as much as the classes are important and the experiences, equally important is the community that you build with other cadets, with others that are in the program. Because that's the person, when you're facing a really hard issue, you don't know what to do, you can pick up the phone and say, what are you doing to work on this? And how are you in a different community working on something like this? It's really those networks of how you share best practices. That's how new things get invented. That's how innovation happens, is by those networks that you build in a program like the cadets.
Shaun, Donovan, thank you so much for these inspiring insights, and that you're willing to share with all of us, and really amazing. Thank you for today.
Thank you. And thank you all for your public service. I can't wait to meet you here in New York and in Israel.